Hi to everyone who has already joined the session. We're just going to give a few minutes for the other attendees to join. So sit tight and we will begin the webinar shortly. Hi everyone, for those who have just joined, just give us a couple more minutes while a few more attendees join the session and then we will get started. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Double Verify Rockerbox. My name is Will Burgess. I am the head of professional services at Rockerbox. I run all of our testing product. I also work a lot with our media mix modeling product and also help all of our clients as a strategic consultant, helping them understand how to make decision makings around their measurement systems, how to design and structure their measurement systems, and so on and so forth. I'm very excited to be hosting today's webinar. This is a really interesting topic. I think that a lot of brands end up with either measurement that doesn't quite work for them or a lot of measurement systems that maybe don't perfectly talk to one another, or certainly some that just provide more uncertainty than certainty because things don't necessarily agree. And obviously that leads to a little bit of confusion. So hopefully in this session, we can talk a little bit about some of that uncertainty, how to make sense of it, and how to make decisions on the back of all of that data that you have. Now, you should all be able to see a chat feature to the side of the screen. So by all means, at any point during the session, please jump in there and ask any questions that you have, and I will do my best to answer questions as they come in. We will definitely not be using the full hour, so you should be able to just leave some questions for the end as well. Kaveh in the chat says, is there a link for another link for a colleague to join? They should be able to use the same link. Otherwise, I believe there might also be a sign up link on our webpage, which will get you to the registration form. And if you get the registration form, then you should be able to get into the webinar once you receive the link. So let me just post that in the chat here for you. So that if you sign up, if your colleague signs up there via that link, the form in that link, then they should get a link to join the session. But let me know if they have any problems. Otherwise, they may be able to join using the link that you shared and just sign in that way. Okay, all right, so let's get into it. So what's the problem that we're going to be talking about today? Well, any modern business these days is pretty much awash in data. You probably don't have any shortage of data if you're a modern business, but you probably, or quite likely, have a hard time making sense of all of it, organizing it in ways that make sense and organize it in ways that are easily supporting your decision making. Now, when I think about the different measurement systems that are out there, they all answer slightly different questions, they work in slightly different ways, they have different methodologies, and the result is that you often end up with a lot of different things that don't quite talk to one another, or they don't quite agree. And so there's often a temptation, I would say, to add on yet another layer of measurement. So these two things don't agree, let's add on a third layer. Or these three things don't agree, let's add on a fourth layer. Like this fourth layer will be the one that breaks the tie and really helps me understand exactly what it is that I'm looking at and how I should make my decisions. But actually, sometimes that just makes the situation worse, because instead of having two things that don't agree, you now have three things that don't agree. Or instead of three that don't agree, you have four that don't agree. And so you haven't really fixed the problem, you're just sort of layering on more different ways to think and interpret. And actually, what you need is clear thinking and a framework for interpretation. I will, before we move on, just pause and say that I always like to describe marketing as the art of decision making in uncertain situations. And I think that really applies here, that you're never going to get true certainty out of your data. You know, true certainty about everything that's going on is almost impossible to achieve, just because so much data is invisible to us. If you think about all the word of mouth that's going on around your brands, you can never see that. You might be able to see signals of it, little echoes of that kind of behavior, but you can't observe it perfectly. And so there will always be things like that. There will always be some kind of uncertainty. And it's really, how do you operate in that uncertain environment, and how do you continue to make decisions and move forward? That's really the job of marketing, or one of the many jobs of marketing, I should say. So we're going to talk today broadly about three systems, or three types of system: attribution, marketing mix modeling, and incrementality testing. Now, you could ask, well, you know, where does, say, Google Analytics fit into this, or where does some other tool that I have fit into this? Broadly speaking, most tools can be assigned into one of these three categories. I would argue that something like Google Analytics really belongs in that first category under attribution. It is, for marketing purposes, an attribution system. It has its drawbacks, like all marketing measurement, or like all attribution measurement systems, but it certainly would sit in that category. So this isn't necessarily a perfect framing of every kind of system that we have, but it's a good enough bucketing for our purposes that we can start thinking about how to use these for making decisions. So just before we move on, I expect that most people on this webinar have heard of these, know what they are, have some kind of understanding. But I'll just give a very high-level overview in case there are some people that don't. So multi-touch attribution, that's obviously the way that a system will pick up a bunch of different digital signals, primarily digital signals, they don't have to be, and tie them together to a single user and observe that user's interaction with marketing, be it a view, a click, the receipt of an email, or the receipt of a piece of direct mail, and then their ultimate either conversion or non-conversion in buying or not buying a product. So you're really trying to take all of the data that you have, all of the signals, all the identifiers, and collapse that to the level of a single user based on any type of match or join that we can possibly make. So extremely, extremely granular methodology. Media mix modeling or marketing mix modeling is almost the opposite. That is very zoomed out. So we're just looking for statistical relationships and correlations between either revenue and conversions or some other kind of KPI, some business result that you want, and the overall spend or activity that you have in your marketing. So that could be how much am I spending on Meta and how much am I getting back in revenue for that spend on Meta. And we're doing that at the level of entire campaigns across a very long period of time, typically about 2 years. So completely different methodology, nothing granular. We don't worry about the user journey. We're not trying to stitch together things along a path or a user journey at all. We're really just trying to look statistically, can I find a relationship between how much I'm spending on a particular channel and what my KPI is doing. And then incrementality testing is different again, and maybe you could argue sort of sits in between the two, right? It's a lot more time bound. So typically our tests would only run for a month, maybe 2 months at the outside. Very rarely they would run longer, but it does happen. So they're very time bound. You're probably only measuring a single channel or a single type of strategy at the same time. And we are actually forcing a test design or an experimental design on the world. So we're saying we're going to show certain people ads and we're not going to show other people ads mostly. There's a few different ways to achieve that, but obviously that gets much more into the realm of causality. So rather than just looking at what are all the things that we can identify that a person did to interact with marketing before they converted, that doesn't necessarily tell us whether they would have converted anyway or not. It's still blind to things like word of mouth. Incrementality testing is saying, well, these people saw the ads, these people did not. And so we know that the only difference between these groups is whether they saw advertising or not. So we know any lift in their conversion, their propensity to convert is going to be due to that advertising. So 3 very, very different methodologies, and we're going to talk about all of them, how they interact and how to think about them differently and how to make decisions off of them differently as we go through this presentation. So the first thing that people will often figure out once they start working with multiple methodologies like these is that they don't agree. You know, you might have attribution telling you that the ROAS of social is 2, while MMM tells you that it's 3 or something like that, or maybe even more. You know, maybe the discrepancy is even wider. So it's worth just digging into kind of why is this? Fundamentally, why is this? Well, the first thing is that you have different attribution windows. So an attribution window is just a way of saying, how far back should we look from the point of a purchase or the point of conversion to see if there is any marketing activity? Because arguably you could say that if I show someone a TV ad or a social ad a year ago and then they convert today, can we really be certain that that ad did anything? I mean, that was so long ago. It's very unlikely that they're going to have remembered that ad from so long ago. So you have a different look back window, a different attribution window. And attribution tends to look at relatively short parts because we're just looking at things that we can identify. Those signals do degrade over time. So even if we could grab that ad from a year ago and assign it to that conversion, that's actually quite hard to do because people change their device, or they move address, or they change their email, or, you know, all of these signals kind of degrade, and it's harder to stitch together that path. MMM doesn't care, you know, it doesn't need to be able to identify a single user, and so it can capture effects that are a bit more drawn out and maybe get into your upper funnel media and things like that. You have different inputs, so obviously MTA relies on those very granular user level signals. MMM is aggregated, so it's just that daily overall spend by channel or KPI. And they have different methodologies. So we talked about this on the previous page, right? MTA is trying to distribute credit using an algorithm based on all of the touch points that it can see in all of these journeys, whereas MMM is looking for statistical relationships. When I raise spend in Meta, does my revenue go up? When I increase spend in display, does my revenue go up? So it's a very different methodology. And likewise, testing, again, like we talked about on the previous page, very different methodology. You're forcing an experimental design onto the real world, and you're looking for evidence that that experiment showed lift in a particular channel. And then there might be different external factors that either can or cannot be considered within each of these methodologies. So MMM will account for things like seasonality, competition, macroeconomic factors. We can include all of these things into the model as features, and all of them are kind of accounted for and taken care of, whereas MTA doesn't tell us anything about the impact of the economic environment. And testing, while testing is typically, I would say, sort of immune to being polluted by a lot of these things, these outside forces, it doesn't explicitly measure them either. So very, very different treatments. So fundamentally, what does all of this mean? Well, if you're using different time periods, different data, different methodologies, different treatments of external factors, then you would expect the results from all of these things to be different. I think it's unrealistic to say, well, all of these should align. The disagreement is actually expected. This is a feature of any marketing ecosystem, is that you're going to have different things that disagree. By design, they disagree. And so what you're looking for is a way to think about them all differently and act on them all differently, not necessarily a way to say, well, I just have to have them agree. You know, one of them must be wrong. Saying one of them must be wrong is not really the right way of thinking about it. They're all just measuring different things in different ways. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong about any of them. I think fundamentally also, it's worth remembering that if they all agreed, if everything kind of matched perfectly, so if we had the same result from attribution, from MMM, from testing, then by definition, we wouldn't really need all of them, right? We could just have a single system, because we know that if I just have attribution, MMM would match it, testing would match it. Therefore, I don't need those, right? I can just have a single piece of the puzzle. I can have a single methodology, and that's everything that I need. I don't need any more information than that. If they all agreed, or if they all disagree, then obviously that's actually more interesting. Then they're all bringing something different to my decision-making process. They're all bringing a new piece of information that can help me. So if you find yourself thinking, well, I know I need MMM because I know that it operates in this way, I know that it will do these extra things for me, you shouldn't necessarily be also thinking, I need it to agree with my other systems. In fact, it should be the opposite. You need it to disagree. You need it to disagree, because that's how it's going to give you something new, fresh information that you can act on. Okay, so let's get into a few of the ways that some of these things do disagree, and we can examine a little bit of why and how to think about it. So multi-touch attribution. Let's say that attribution and MMM disagree. Why could that be? Well, or in what case could this be? Well, let's say that attribution is giving a lot of credit to my lower funnel channels, things that are very clickable, they're very trackable. And so MMM, on the other hand, seems to just be giving a lot more credit to my upper funnel channels, right? This kind of stands to reason. I mean, that's sort of by design. That's why we want these two methodologies. So attribution, if we just had attribution, it might say, well, I probably don't need all of this upper funnel spend. It doesn't seem to be doing much for me. I can just rely on, you know, branded search or remarketing or something like that. But MMM is going to tell you the opposite. It's actually going to look away from those very, very lower funnel channels and maybe assign credit elsewhere. So when you're acting on this, just think carefully, right? MMM, probably they're much more useful for setting big upper funnel guardrails, budget by channel guardrails, and then MTA, you're going to use that much more granularly. So you might be using attribution to optimize within channels between strategies, and within those guardrails that have been set by MMM. So MMM might tell you, actually, keep 40% of your spend more in your upper funnel channels, and then use MTA to operate within them. So very different use cases, very different ways of acting on that data. What about testing and attribution? So this is a very interesting one. We do quite frequently see testing and attribution disagreeing. And it's worth remembering that typically, but not always, but typically, attribution is not a way of measuring incremental lift of a particular channel. Attribution is measuring any little bit of impact that it could possibly find. And if it just finds a single search click and then a conversion, then it's going to give all the credit for that conversion to that single search click. Whereas, of course, we know that there's probably a lot of word of mouth or other unseen things that maybe we can't measure in attribution. And so we need to find another way of picking those up. So we might find that in attribution, branded search gets a ROAS estimate of, say, 10. Very, very good. But when we test it, we might find that actually testing this causal truth or causal ground truth that we're trying to uncover gives it, say, a 3. And really the fundamental difference here is that testing is measuring the incremental impact of your media, whereas attribution is not. Attribution is measuring the total. Everything that could possibly be assigned back to a channel based on the data that we have is going to be assigned by attribution. Testing is going to tell us how much of that is truly due to that channel and how much would have happened anyway. And so trying to pick apart those two things is really critical. That is the whole point of incrementality testing. And for that reason, testing and MTA are never really expected to agree. They might in some cases agree, especially if you're a small brand. If some of your channels are very new, then you would expect them to be very incremental, so they will be close. But in most cases, they should absolutely disagree. And you can use the test to tell you, should I or should I not be in this channel? You know, let's say it's for paid social. The test will tell you the ROAS is 3, 4. Great, that's above my threshold. I should be investing. I'll start spending. I'm going to set my budget. And then MTA, again, gives you that really granular view inside that channel. What are the things that are working? How should we be moving budget around within that channel? So very similar setup to MMM versus MTA in a way, where we're using testing or MMM to set the budget, MTA to do that daily optimization or weekly optimization. You can also, of course, calibrate your MTA based on testing. That's a very, very good use case for testing. Okay, what about testing and MMM? Well, this is a really interesting one because testing and MMM, they both measure incremental impact. So they should be, in theory, a lot closer than, say, testing and MTA or MMM and MTA. But there are still some fundamental difference. A classic MMM will typically run over 2 years, minimum of 2 years of data to be able to identify all your seasonal trends and so forth. That's what we're using for that media mix model. Whereas a test, like I said at the beginning, that's probably only something like 30 days, very, very short window. And so even if you just think about that, you've got 2 years of data for an MMM and just 4 weeks for a test, sorry, you should see completely different results. I mean, it'd be very, very difficult to believe that they would be overlapping. And so for a test, always just remember that the time of year when you ran that test can make a very, very big difference, especially if you're a seasonal business. So let's say that I'm a business that operates gyms. There's going to be a lot of organic demand in the market in January. That's typically when people turn over a new leaf, they want to get into the gym. And so all of that organic demand, if I tested in January, would really have a big, big sway on my test. I would it's arguably going to be quite hard for me to drive excess demand in January when there's just so much organic demand sort of sloshing around in the market. Whereas if I were testing in the middle of the summer or something when there's a lot less organic demand, I expect to find a very different result. So the time frame, the window when you're testing makes a big, big difference and will always provide a little bit of disagreement with your MMM. So you're really looking more for just directional alignment as opposed to perfect alignment. What do I mean by directional alignment? It's really just thinking about, is this a channel I feel very strongly about? I should definitely be spending more. Do I feel like the channel is okay? Or do I feel like it's bad and I should just get out of it? Obviously, if you have an MMM that says that the channel is terrible, you should get out, and a test that says it's great, then maybe you do have a problem. But as long as they broadly are moving in the right direction, then you should be feeling pretty good about that. Okay, so let's think about a framework for decision-making across some of these systems. Firstly, remember that every measurement system has uncertainty. And uncertainty, like I said at the beginning, is sort of the whole point of marketing, right? It is not something to be afraid of. This is just the job. And what's important is that you understand how confident you should feel with each of your different measurement methodologies and each of the different results. So you might have an MMM where you've been given the confidence intervals as part of the output, and the confidence intervals are tight. The model is very confident in what it's predicted. Okay, we feel super confident in that. Whereas, let's say that you have attribution, but the attribution system that you're using, if you're using Google Analytics, is not super robust. We know that it doesn't have great view-through data. It's very click-based. Maybe it's last click instead of multi-touch. Well, in that case, I don't have a ton of confidence in that. And so I'm actually going to assign more weight to one system when I'm making my decision making and less weight to the other. I'm still going to use my GA4 data just as a sort of sense check, a sanity check, while using my MMM data as the primary. But it could be that for others, maybe you don't even have an MMM. You just have attribution plus some tests. And so you're forced to think about it in another way. But just at least assigning some kind of confidence assessments to each of your systems will get you a long way. So that takes us on to point number 2. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty. It's really to start making those decisions with that uncertainty. So despite of that uncertainty. Try and set your confidence thresholds in advance, especially when you're thinking about testing. Are you going to be good with a 50% confidence interval? Probably not. What about 80? What about 90? Try and think about what would be good enough for you to invest more in a channel or less. At the very least, I would encourage everyone, all of my clients, to always have a return on ad spend threshold or a CPA threshold that they need to hit in order to feel confident with a decision. So if you need to hit 2, great, decide that in advance and stick to it. If something comes in at a 1.7, even though you have a lot of love for that channel, it's just not good enough. You're going to need to move on and keep looking to find a channel that really works for you. This 4th one is probably the hardest for a lot of people to start thinking about. So it's very, very common for people to get anchored around, well, what exactly is the ROAS for this channel? It's 3.2. That's the exact answer. But unfortunately, the world is a lot more complicated than that. And actually starting to think in terms of ranges, confidence ranges, is much more useful than just thinking in that exact estimate. So instead of saying, well, it's 3.2, we know it's 3.2, you might be more accurate if you say it's between 2 and 4. It varies throughout the year. It varies based on the campaign, the creative, whether there are promos running at the time, but it's between 2 and 4, and we should budget on that basis. The challenge, of course, is that finance departments don't love that. They want to know exactly what they're getting back for their media investment. And if you tell them, well, it's between this many million and this many million, that's much, much harder. But certainly within a marketing team, if you can encourage a little bit more of this thinking, that would be, I think, a really, really great direction to move into. Action bias wins. So much better to move just incrementally, a bit by bit, rather than getting stuck, not making any decisions, or stuck really struggling to move because you're just not sure how to interpret the data. So you don't necessarily need to know whether the ROAS of a channel is exactly 4.5 or exactly 5.4 to know it's good enough that I'm going to increase my budget 10% on this channel and reduce it on some other channel in order to be able to start moving things in the right direction. So starting to move, getting confident, just moving small bits at a time based on the data that you have, that's always going to be better than just sitting around waiting for yet another data point to come on. And then document your reasoning. This is why I think we all love Slack, is that it's an easy place to document things. You can always find them in the future. So if you can just make sure that you get into the rigor of explaining why you've taken a certain action based on what data, then that will set you up for success in the future. Okay, practical steps that you can take to unify your measurement view. Audit your measurement stack. We have done webinars in the past and I've talked with a lot of different customers in the past about how to do this, how to identify the gaps in your measurement, figure out the overlaps and where things are conflicting. That will very, very quickly align you around where you need to advance your systems in order to fill any gaps that exist. Aligning on a KPI, super, super important. If you have two systems and they're just talking different languages because one is in LTV and one is in new customer revenue or something like that, then it's going to be, you're making your life very, very hard for yourself. Very hard to make decisions if you don't have at least alignment in the KPI. Calibration tests, so using experiments to sanity check some of the outputs that you're getting from attribution or from MMM. Very, very important, very, very useful. I know I have warned already in this presentation against doing too much of this kind of activity, spending too much time kind of double checking and triple checking things. But if you really are stuck and you have no confidence in your existing measurement solutions around one particular channel, then a test can be a good tiebreaker. Aligning around a measurement calendar, a learning agenda. This is very important. This will allow you to plan tests around your calendar, your schedule, your promo schedule. And so you might not know exactly what you're going to find out, but you have a plan to get there. And just having that plan makes that decision making that much easier. And then a shared reporting layer. So having all of the data that you have learned and all of the test results that you have and all of your MMM outputs all in a place that they are very, very easily discoverable, that is super important. The more discoverable things are, the more likely you are to retain that institutional knowledge, even if there's turnover in your team, the more easy it will be for you to share it out with your internal stakeholders and so on and so forth. So making sure everything is accessible is very important. Okay, getting into the key takeaways, and then we can wrap up. So firstly, I would say, as a reminder, if your measurement systems always agreed with each other, then you wouldn't need all of them. So embrace that disagreement, embrace that uncertainty. That is the whole point of having all of these different systems that don't agree. They're not designed to, in fact, they're designed to disagree. They're using tons of different data, different time ranges, they're using different methodologies. They should all be very different. Second is that each of these tools is designed to see something different. So the fact that they're conflicting means that they are working properly, and that is what you're looking for. So definitely be happy when you see that conflicting output. The best, most sophisticated clients that I work with really embrace those plot twists. When they discover something new, hey, this channel is actually working better than we thought it was working, that's really a great moment. That's exactly what you should be looking for. The challenge is typically not the data, it's just what you do with it. So I talked earlier again about this idea that marketing is the art of decision-making with uncertainty. And so it's not really, the uncertainty isn't the problem, it's just about making sure you're avoiding getting stuck when these signals diverge from one another. And then try and always match each of your measurement tools to a different business question or a different business problem. Whenever I am embarking on a measurement journey with a client or planning a test, I will always start with the question, well, what action do you want to take? So don't start with just, we want to measure paid social or we want to measure meta. What is the action you're trying to take? The action could be, I want to know if I have any evidence to suggest I should increase my spend on Meta. Okay, increasing spend on Meta, that's an action, right? That's something that we can structure a measurement system around. And the more that you can commit to that ahead of time, so if the ROAS shows up to be above a 3, then I will increase my spend by 10%, the better. But always think about keeping that action front and center before you put in place any measurement system. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, control your data and don't let it control you. So make sure that you're doing everything that you can to wrangle your systems and your data into a place where they are serving your decisions and not just leading you to get stuck and really struggle to make those decisions. Okay, and then I'll just wrap up with one very simple slide. So just very, very high level, if I had to assign roles and ways to make decisions and act off of each of these three systems. Attribution, that's the closest thing that we have to a real-time optimization engine based on data, right? So the data is constantly refreshed. All the conversions that you're getting every day are flooding in there. It's a wash in data, and it's very, very quick to refresh itself. So if you need to know over a weekend or during the course of a week what's working and what's not working, what should we pull back and what should we push forward, attribution is your friend. Really frequent, close to real-time decision making. Marketing mix modeling, that is a much slower process. So that's for high-level budgeting decisions, big swings in spend between channels across time over the course of months, quarters, years. You know, these things take a long time, and it's not for very, very fast-paced, quick, rash decision making that you're doing every single day or every single week. Leave that to attribution. Marketing mix modeling is where you set the big strategies, the big quarterly budgets. And then incrementality testing, this is when you really kind of surgically zoom in on a single channel. You can use the data from there to calibrate your MTA and MMM to confirm your suspicions or your hunches. I have a suspicion that brand search isn't doing as much as I thought. I have a suspicion that remarketing isn't doing as much as I thought. Testing is how you figure that out. It's how you ask a very specific question. Should I cut this budget? Should I increase this budget? MMM is much for what should my overall budget be, right? My action is I need to set a budget for the next quarter. What should that budget look like? Incrementality testing is much, much more specific and much, much more detailed than that. Okay, that is everything we had in terms of slides. I'm going to wait a couple of minutes in case there are questions in the chat. So if you have a question that you want to ask, please drop it in there and I will answer live before we wrap up. And if after a minute or two we haven't had any questions, then we can end the session and I will bid you all a good afternoon. So I'm going to wait another minute and see if anyone puts a question in the chat for us. Do you mind going back to the key takeaway slides? Yeah, of course. As always, with all of these webinars, I'll always let everyone know that I'm always happy to talk measurement. If anyone wants to get half an hour with me, you're more than welcome to. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. My name, again, is Will Burgess, spelled B-U-R-G-H-E-S. So if you want to talk privately, get any advice, just let me know. Just send me a message, send me a DM on LinkedIn, and we can set up some time to talk. Okay, I don't see any extra questions in the chat, apart from Alexis asking to go back and check out the key takeaway slide. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the session here. Thank you all for attending. We will have future webinars coming up in the second half of the year. So hopefully all of you are on our mailing list. You should get an email when those get set up. And I look forward to seeing many of you on the next one. So thanks everyone and good afternoon.